Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Theodore Roosevelt inaugural National Historic Site, Western New York's only National Park Service site here in Western New York, and one of only 4 places in the annals of American history where a president has taken the oath of office outside the nation's capital. This house has had a very storied history, a very varied history. You're in our visitor center now, and this was built specifically because we ran out of room and didn't have a place to put on programs. So this opened to the public in June of 2009, and I was telling the gentleman at the table that there was once upon a time a carriage house, so it looked very much like the exterior of this facility, but SHPO, in its infinite wisdom, said that you can get funding for this, and we'll help any way we can, but you can't build an exact replica of what was here at the time. It can look similar, but you can't build it. So what do? We start digging, and what do we find? The original foundation of that carriage house, which, by the way, was torn down in the late 30s. Like so many places along this block of Delaware Avenue, it was torn down by the restaurateurs who owned the property at the time in order to accommodate this thing called a car, so that they could have additional parking for the folks who were coming here to eat and imbibe. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome Sara Capen to the site tonight. And actually, I'm really honored because I'm in awe of this woman. She is just such a dynamo that I'm really excited to talk to her about all the things that hopefully we can work on as we go forward, and shame on me that I haven't had more of those conversations with you up until this point. A visionary, collaborative, results-focused, national executive leader, proven success record in identifying challenges and providing large-scale infrastructure solutions on a city, regional, and national level that drive economic development. In addition, she skillfully designed and implemented tourism heritage products that have improved inclusivity and driven substantial economic advancement for over a decade in the Niagara Falls area. These transformative initiatives have been accomplished through overcoming complex hurdles, I'm sure there have been many, and navigating a bipartisan political environment, along with advocating for cultural-centric solutions to protect, connect, and promote people and places that bring America's stories to life across the United States. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Sara Beilein Capen.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. Sam, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, too. It's so very kind of you. And I would simply say that to start off with, I'm going to blame my dad, who Mr. Patterson knows really well, for leading to those accomplishments, because he always read to me Theodore Roosevelt's To Dare, right? To dare greatly, to do big things, the man in the arena, since a young age, right? And it gives me goosebumps thinking about that, because that's been ingrained in me. And I shouldn't blame him, right? But that also has led to a lot of work. And addressing complex challenges certainly comes with scars, right? But Theodore Roosevelt certainly knew that, and his resilience was something that's always inspired me, from overcoming his health issues to continuing to rise, to advocate, to be a fighter, to be that man in the arena. Was something that I was drawn to since a young age. So thank you to the Theodore Roosevelt site. Thank you, Patricia, for inviting me here tonight. I know that many of you probably aren't aware of National Heritage Areas, other than the people who know me. So who in the room knows the National Heritage Area and what we're about? A little bit? A little bit, okay. Two roles I wanted to talk about today, and it's really expanding on Theodore Roosevelt's vision of that preservation of place in the United States, in America, in terms of what that means, that iconic places are so important to who we are as people. And National Heritage Areas are an extension of that. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about that today. Big disclaimer here, PowerPoint is not my superpower. And Patricia probably knows that because I delayed and delayed and delayed. So a little bit about National Heritage Areas. We are part of the National Park Service. We are a National Park Service system and a part of the National Park Service family. And we were incorporated by President Ronald Reagan as a new national park. And what I always say about it is national parks create a striking image of a landscape, right? You can think of your favorite one right now. You can think about Yellowstone or Grand Tetons or the Smoky Mountains. You can think about the Theodore Roosevelt site, right? But heritage areas go one step further. They look at the history that's layered on top of that landscape, right? From indigenous people to today. And we are the keepers of all those stories that are layered on that landscape. And very much the keepers of America's stories. There's only 62 National Heritage Areas in the system. There's over 400 National Park Service units. And I think that's pretty special. I think it's pretty special that President Ronald Reagan coined this a new national park because they were designed intentionally to work with communities and in conversation, to talk about our history, to bridge the differences that we have, whether it's political differences, whether it's religious differences, whether it's social differences. They're built to have conversations around the table about who we are as people within a landscape. And so this idea of a locally driven model demonstrates the preservation and celebration of American history and culture. And the difference between a National Heritage Area and a national park, again, is a lot of times national parks come from that top-down approach. They come in, and the National Park Service, and I love them, will tell you exactly how they would like things done, the way they would like things printed. And we're the opposite. We put people around the table and say, what would you like to see happen in this project? What's important about this story that shaped Niagara Falls? What's your voice? Let's find your place at the table and give you that power to voice that experience that you've had or your family's had or history has had in that place. And that's very different. So it's a locally driven solution that also requires us to match our federal appropriations. So we receive a federal appropriation, but we're required to match that 1-to-1. Presently, Niagara Falls matches at 5-to-1. And what that means is that that's also that buy-in, so that you work with entities that are within your location that contribute to that story, that find their place at the table and are willing to invest in that community-driven solution. And so that's what makes heritage areas a little bit different than national parks. So I always look at it as a national parks, and I believe this is on my slide, this is the National Heritage Area System, but national parks were America's best idea, right? To preserve it. There's no other place in the world that has the national parks that we do. And national heritage areas are the extension of that. We go a little bit deeper. We're in lived-in landscapes. So if you look at this map here, these are the 62 National Heritage Areas that are represented. The most recent legislation passed this past December, which expanded our family. We grew from 55 to 62, which is exciting. Those aren't marked on this, so we added St. Croix National Heritage Area, which is the first one that would be in a territory. We added Northern Neck National Heritage Area, which is in Virginia, Down East Maine, which is in Maine, Southern Maryland, the Great Dismal Swamp, Alabama Black Belt, and Black Metropolis Bronzeville. And I think what you're going to hear too is that the names are pretty distinct, right? Like you think about that. What does Alabama Black Belt mean? Where did that name come from? Right? Well, it actually came from the very, very rich soil in Alabama. And then that name was determined by those local stakeholders. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but I wanted you to see the overall picture of a National Heritage Area. And I think this is where play needs to be hit on the PowerPoint behind, so you can actually see.
Forward click once more.
Forward click. Oh, thank you. The man so these are all the names of National Heritage Areas. So take a look. The Chapelaya. We stretch across 38 states and thousands of communities. So heritage areas can be as small as Niagara Falls, which we are 13 miles. They can cross 4 states, like Journey Through Hollow Ground, which interprets the Civil War history. They can be 62 counties, like Looking for Lincoln in Illinois. Freedom's Frontier, good example there, is actually interpreting the division between Kansas and Missouri, right? And so all these places are keepers of America's story that are very, very, very specific. The National Park Service determines our interpretive themes. And then we work with them, but we work with our community to begin to tell those stories. As you're just looking at these, New York State has 5 National Heritage Areas. Niagara Falls, Finger Lakes, Erie Canalway, Champlain, which is actually 2 states, New York and Vermont. And then you have Hudson River. And so, you know, it's exciting to see the growth in our program, but you can also see how representative heritage areas are of stories. So think about it, National Coal Heritage Area, which is in West Virginia. Very specific, but it's dedicated to telling the history of coal in our country. Oil region tells the history of oil in our region. National Aviation is the story around the Wright brothers. We have heritage areas that stretch into battlefields, Shenandoah Valley, pertaining to the Civil War. Silos and smokestacks, a good example. Any guesses where silos and smokestacks might be located?
Pittsburgh.
No? Rivers of Steel is Pittsburgh.
Gary, Indiana.
No? It's the only heritage area in Iowa. Right. And so you know, each of these heritage areas, and I'll just go forward, is really very much committed to those locally driven solutions, but reflect some very, very deep and significant stories about who we are as Americans. And we, as heritage areas, always talk about the of, by, for. Heritage areas of the people, by the people, for the people. When we make decisions, we are sitting around the table and talking about that, talking about the interpretation, talking about what this project looks like for small towns, for suburbs, for urban communities, where Niagara Falls is one of the few heritage areas that has an urban center as part of it. Many national heritage areas are located in rural communities that we know that our rural communities have been hurting quite a bit in terms of the loss of all sorts of industrial related jobs and the migration of people. And so heritage areas are a way to be able to tell our history, drive economic impact, create revitalizations in small towns, be able to connect people to trails like the Erie Canalway, to be able to improve health and wellness, to be able to connect kids to become those future stewards, which we should talk about a lot with the national parks. Our future stewards are our children. If we're not doing enough with them, we're not going to pass that legacy off. It's very similar to any kind of community service club, whether it's the Lions Club, whether it's service-orientated groups. Anytime you enter a room, you should be bringing a young person with you so they understand the importance of it, right? Otherwise, why are they going to care? What's their buy-in in the world of social media where they can see it on TikTok, right? And so we really want to be able to engage our youth in everything that we do, and this is across the national heritage areas, because it is the next generation of stewards. And each place is deeply precious. The Theodore Roosevelt inaugural site is precious. So you have to ask yourself, who are your next stewards, right? Who's gonna fall in love with the Theodore Roosevelt story? Who are gonna want to put the time, energy, and work into preserving this place? And those are the type of questions and engagement that we have with our young people. So, just to go a little bit further, and I think Theodore Roosevelt would really appreciate this, everything regarding national heritage areas involves an act of Congress. And I'm sincere when I say this, and we've had to have quite a few. And one of our greatest champions is Congressman Paul Tonka, who's down in Hudson River at the other end of the state. But if you just look at what he said, he understands that we preserve and protect sites of historical and natural significance. We shine a light on those local communities very brightly. We bring in federal investment, but we also match federal investment, right? So if we're bringing in money into Niagara Falls, we're matching it 5-to-1. Right, and that continues to grow. And the two most important things that Representative Tonka will say is that not only are we preserving and protecting the stories that are critical to who we are in the fabric of a nation, but it's critical to be able to instill a pride of place for the people who live there, right? Just coming to Theodore Roosevelt today, right? Like, this is in our backyard. And how many people realize that? Right? How many people can see the legacy of Theodore Roosevelt in their communities directly, right? And so that pride of place that can be so easily lost, and I would argue that, it may be one of Niagara Falls' greatest sins, is urban renewal, eviscerated our fabric, our visible fabric of history in Niagara Falls. And what has happened is then people don't understand what this place meant. And you get to a place today, 2023, where I'm working, Aaron's working alongside me, and you talk about what this place means, but you have no visible evidence because we tore down all of our historic buildings, or predominantly a lot of them, right? The hydraulic canal. The downtown in Buffalo is very different. You can look at it and you get a sense of place because of the architecture, right? Something happened here. It's easy to see that, right? And it's hard to find that in Niagara Falls. And so how do you create a sense of pride of place if you don't have that visible identity left? You have to do it through storytelling. And you have to put in a lot of work. And you have to ask hard questions, but you want that pride of place because that's what creates those future stewards, right? That's what creates a sense of community in neighborhoods. That's what creates commitment to volunteerism in neighborhoods. Is why is it important? Why was this place important? And why do I care about it now? Right? And that's what we really try to aspire with national heritage areas. Another champion is Senator Debbie Stabenow, who was introduced our Senate bill in 2021 that passed out of Congress in December of 2022. So she represents Motor City's National Heritage Area, which I probably don't need to ask where that is located, if everybody get it, right? Michigan. And so she understands that part of the powerful role of creating heritage areas is the economic vibrancy it brings to places around that storytelling. So it does create jobs. It creates heritage tourism. Anybody that's a cultural tourist knows that you spend more because you're drawn to that power place. You want to know what's behind things, right? It's not per se in Orlando, right? It is actually a place where you can discover something more that's not maybe amusement based, and I'm not knocking on Orlando, but people travel to better understand who we are. And you find that in our history. And so Senator Stabenow has been a tremendous champion for us. And I would like to bring this up because I think, Stanton referenced this in terms of advocacy. Which all of you are great advocates because you're here tonight. You want to know more, right? You want to know more and you want to be able to be those stewards. So I only bring this up because I think that Theodore Roosevelt would appreciate this in terms of not only the legislative hurdle, so you'll find more information about this in here. So for the last 6 years, I've been the chair of the Alliance of National Heritage Areas, which is all 62 national heritage areas. And Congress set up a process where we expired every single year. And so we would have to introduce a new bill, 62 individual bills, if you can imagine this, every single year. And they would have to go through the how to make the bill process. Everybody remembers that, right? I'm not a bill, the PBS, right? So I've got a whole new version of it, which, probably added many wrinkles to my face. But it's not that simple, right? So a bill is introduced, it has to go through the Committee of Authorization, which for us is Natural Resources Committee on the House side, Energy and Natural Resources on the Senate side, and then it has to be voted out of both committees, and then you have to be hoped to be attached to a bigger bill or a standalone bill. So you can imagine this, and you get to do this every 2 years, right? So you can see that it doesn't work. And so what would happen is this whole congressional system that you're all familiar with, because you look at the news and you're like, why is this not working? Right? We would be caught up in this, and we'd only be authorized for 1 year at a time. So we'd have to start that process over every single year. So we created a solution that was actually a 15-year reauthorization for every heritage area in the program. And that was called the National Heritage Area Act. And Representative Tonko and Senator Stabenow, as well as Senator Blunt from Missouri, and also G.T. Thompson from Pennsylvania supported it. And, if it doesn't work and you get into your re-election years, you have to start over again, which I just said in 2 years. This year we had a little magic happening. So we passed out of suspension in the House twice, actually, got to the Senate, passed out of the ENR committee, which required unanimous vote. And then this past fall, we didn't have a pathway to get out of the Senate or the House overall. And so we came down to a standalone bill. And a standalone bill requires unanimous consent. That requires 100 US senators to vote for it. So Friday, December 16th, I get this phone call, and we had this standalone bill that everybody said was impossible. Everybody in the world said there's no way that this is going to happen. We find out that we have 2 blocks on the bill, one from a senator in Arkansas and one from North Dakota. By Tuesday night, we had both those blocks lifted, and we had a unanimous vote. 100 US senators voted on a standalone bill to reauthorize national heritage areas. It's not over with that, right? Because they had to go to the House, and now you only have 2 days of Congress left, Wednesday and Thursday, and you had an epic blizzard that was coming to Buffalo, right? And so people were hustling, and we needed a rules committee to allow us to pass and change the rule from a vote on suspension, which required 2/3 House members, to a majority vote. And Congressman Tonko had to participate in that rules committee, and he testified by train going back from Albany to DC because he didn't think this was going to happen, right? And so the final summary is that we had 426 votes. This is the House votes alone on the last day of Congress, and this was signed into law. And if you take a look at it, it's right on the inside of this great publication. The National Heritage Area Act, and it was signed in by President Biden on January 5th. And it reauthorized everybody for 15 years so we could focus on doing the good work we're doing versus trying to advocate to stay alive each single year. So it was a tremendous legislative victory. This long, winding road details it a little bit more. I have been part of it and leading that effort since 2016. And honestly, I just couldn't do it anymore. I was like, no. We made it out of committee. I'm not starting this process over again. But that's that resiliency. That's that resilient spirit. But when you look at it, you talk about bipartisanship, there's only 95 no votes. And most of those come from Texas, which didn't have a heritage area, right? And so the legacy to this is not a tutorial on the legislative process for all of you, because I would bore you to death. It's actually telling you that democracy works, right? Democracy can work when we advocate together. And to be part of that process was probably one of the highlights of my entire life. But it's a message for young people to not give up. It's a message for all of us in this room to say change can happen. And you do get setbacks. We were setback so many times and told it was impossible so many times. Just like Theodore Roosevelt was told things were impossible many, many times, right? But that arc, that legacy of him creating the National Park System led to this today, right? Which is a beautiful story. So, no more about the legislative process, but if you'd like me to further explain that, or when I do my new TikTok about how to create a bill, I will share it with all of you, because it's a totally different version. So, getting to the Niagara Falls National Heritage Area. We were authorized by Congress in 2008. And so when you get authorized by Congress, they want to make sure that they designate an area. So we go from LaSalle and Niagara Falls all the way down to Old Fort Niagara, some tremendous partners here. But we are to preserve, protect, and promote the natural, cultural, and historic resources of Niagara Falls and the Niagara region, and partner with sites like Theodore Roosevelt in Erie County and other sites in Niagara County. And I think that this is a tremendous testament to our work. Is we do a lot of projects. You can see 2022 is right here. I have an extra one if you didn't get one. But we are a true wheel horse in the community that takes on just about anything. In the first opening of this, one of the things I write in my opening is about just saying yes. Saying yes. And the importance of saying yes, especially when community members bring something to you, because it's so much easier to say no. I would have said no. I should have said no probably 100 times, but we wouldn't have all these projects, right? We wouldn't have the Discover Niagara Shuttle, which coincidentally also required unanimous votes. I don't know how that's part of the trajectory of my life, to be able to pass it to law as well. But just to talk about the Discover Niagara Shuttle, this vehicle system, which is approximately 8 vehicles now, connects people to, what are we up to, Aaron? 26 different sites? Oh, we're past that. We got to be close to like 30 different sites in Niagara County.
That was 4 miles. Yeah.
Right? And so this started in 2016, designed intentionally, first and foremost, to be able to connect people to the amazing sites in the Niagara region. For the 7 million or so, more or less, people who come to Niagara Falls could hop on this for free, go to places like Lewiston, Youngstown, Old Fort Niagara, Stella Niagara, the Power Project, right? And see our tremendous history, which also extends their stay. And when you extend stay, you drive economic impact. Right? One additional stay, overnight stay in a hotel to understand history supports your small businesses. It supports your small museums. And so we've been operating this since 2016. We're expanding this year to Four Mile Creek Campground, which is a spoke in the wheel. We've already connected to Lockport in the Erie Canalway National Heritage Quarter. And one of the one of the other impacts of this project, which is also significantly strong, is that it has social impact in our communities. Because we go into the heart of Niagara Falls, this also provides transportation for people to get to jobs. It provides opportunities for people to get food, which wouldn't have access by public transportation otherwise, to get to medical appointments at Niagara Falls Memorial, or even to be able to connect to not only medical appointments anywhere in the Niagara region. And our public transportation system in Niagara County and Niagara Falls isn't accessible, right? If you were a student and wanted to go to NCCC, you would have to hop on a vehicle from Niagara Falls at 6 in the morning. And that vehicle wouldn't go directly to Sanborn, which is only 13 miles. It comes to Buffalo first, right? And then it goes to Sanborn. So imagine doing that as a single mom with a 2-year-old that's gonna go to daycare at NCCC, right? And then the next bus doesn't depart NCCC until 4 p.m. to get back to Niagara Falls, right? And so this project not only has impacted the experience people have in Niagara Falls in connecting people to our history, it also impacts our community itself in so many different ways. I never in my wildest dreams did I ever think I would be orchestrating a transportation network, but we continue to expand. And this year we have some really exciting possibilities, and a big shout out to Aaron. Aaron's our operation manager. He's right here. Aaron, hand up. A small team, but it's also reflective of a public-private partnership that we were able to contract with a transportation provider, which is at significantly less costs than we would have if the NFTA, for example, took on this project. All of the vehicles are equipped with free Wi-Fi, which is also a point of accessibility. In addition to that, you can experience our history on the digital screens that are located on the shuttle. So we'll start running again Memorial Day weekend. We'll run from Memorial Day to Labor Day. And this is a great example of one of the projects that not only did we create, but we administer today. And so another project that I really wanted to highlight is that we built the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center. How many people here have been there by chance? Oh, awesome. Yeah, so you've been there. I hope you've had a good experience. But this is certainly one of our projects, and what I would refer to as an invisible history. We weren't talking about collectively about the Underground Railroad in Niagara Falls. It was missing from our history. So we're celebrating our 5th year anniversary coming up next week. We made it through the pandemic, which is no easy chore, especially when you just opened the doors in 2018. And continue to educate people on the power that Niagara Falls had in the Underground Railroad in terms of place. You crossed, and freedom seekers who came from the South crossed there for a couple different reasons. Number one, the Niagara River, direct access to Canada, right? Number two, it's the shortest distance for freedom seekers that were coming from New York City or down through Albany, right? You're not gonna cross Lake Ontario just by geography, right? You're gonna cross at the most narrow place. There's boats that go across. Maid of the Mist, where Maid of the Mist is located today, were rowboats that went back and forth all the time. The first suspension bridge was built there that impacted the Underground Railroad. It sped up the ability for freedom seekers to hop on a train and cross right there as well. That's exactly the location where Harriet Tubman crossed, bringing freedom seekers. And then we talked a little bit furthermore about the role our African American waiters at the Cataract House had, invisible history. This was not publicly available until the Underground Railroad Heritage Center opened. If you were a historian or a researcher, you could find it, but we weren't presenting this as one of those powerful chapters of our history. And now we are. And so telling the story of John Morrison, the head waiter of the Cataract House, is so critical because we are giving him a name. We are invoking a memory of people who put their lives at risk to help people who were enslaved cross into Canada. And then we talk more about the legacy of slavery in our communities today. We're approaching the 1-year anniversary of what happened in Buffalo with the Buffalo Massacre, the people who were murdered at the Tops, right? And the long enduring plague that slavery has had on communities, and how it stretches and is reflected in people's cultural understanding, our rules, who we are as people, how we practice policy. And I invite you all there to come back. I invite you all to enter into these conversations with us. I just returned from Muscle Shoals National Heritage Area, which is in northern Alabama. I had the opportunity to go to the Legacy Museum in Montgomery. Very powerful place, right, that interprets enslavement. But when you think about Montgomery, it's also the birthplace of the civil rights movement, and that resistance and resilience of human spirit, again, an attribute that Theodore Roosevelt would appreciate, right? To overcome enslavement, and for people to understand and to pass laws that abolished it. But our desire to still continue to know that that fight still goes on with many people in our communities. The Legacy Museum is also the site of the International Memorial to Justice and Peace, which is also known as the Lynching Memorial. So if you get the opportunity to go there and see it, I get goosebumps. I'm still processing it. But the idea that slavery, while it ended in policy, the legacy continues to evolve. And the Jim Crow and the thousands of people who were lynched in the South through acts of terrorism is part of that legacy. And how do we tell that story? How do we have those conversations? And I think heritage areas are the natural place for those conversations. And certainly the Underground Railroad Heritage Center is one of those locations. This is a project, a fun project. Anybody seen this before? Yeah, so the Prophet Isaiah's Second Coming House. We were gifted this by the Kohler Foundation, who worked with the family of Isaiah Richardson, who was inspired by God and Scripture to create this. And I think that, what I'd like to say about this is, again, Niagara Falls is a complex place. And I think that's probably sometimes a kind way of putting it. But we've lost so much of our history because we've let things either be demolished, or it's easier to turn your head than to actually put a shovel in the ground and say, how do we protect a place like this? How do we protect his story as an artist? And how do we open it up to the community, whether it's community gardens or public programs, which will all be open this summer. We're excited. So the Kohler Foundation partnered with us. They've done almost close to $2.5 million for art restoration that's being shipped back from Pittsburgh at the end of this month and going to be installed. But a loss of this to our community or forgotten is a loss of art. It's a loss of creativity. It's a loss of humanity. And so we are the natural vector for saying, yes, we'll take this on. And we've been working 2 years on this and are excited to be opening the doors. This summer, we just added our ADA accessible ramp today, in fact. We've done a lot of fundraising with it. And I think one of the most remarkable pieces is the red house just to the other side of it. When we first brought in a dumpster, because we had to do a lot of cleanup first, is we invited the community around to also be able to use that dumpster for what they wanted to clean up in their homes. And that immediately created a sense of community and also a sense of pride in that place and cleanup of an area that has been disinvested in and many people would drive by and consider blighted, right? And so that collaboration just with the dumpster alone is a powerful lesson about what National Heritage Areas can do in small places, small neighborhoods, to be that good neighbor. And also to preserve a history so it's not lost. And I would say, one of the first arguments, and not arguments, but the first interactions I had was from a couple sites in Buffalo who was like, we need this. This needs to be here in Buffalo, right? You don't deserve it. Niagara Falls does not deserve this place, right? Well, for those that know me, I was, born redheaded for a reason. And, you know, I will be a defender of that forever, and I will be a defender of Niagara Falls forever. But you're not moving this from Niagara Falls. We are not going to continue to take what belongs here, because it's amazing and powerful and wonderful, and because you think we don't know what we're doing, right? And sometimes you have to find the right partner, and Kohler found us, we found them, and we're really thankful for this. But when you remove this, right, you can see the impact that would have on the community. When you knock down all that represented our hydroelectric power history, how do we tell that story? You know, the power project for what it is not that accessible. People drive right under it, around it, because you really don't know, even despite their welcome, whether you can go in it, right? But I will tell you that if the remaining buildings of the Shilcott Power Plant, the remaining buildings of the Dean Adams Transformer Complex were still there, people would know the importance of that place, right? And so this is why it's really important for us to preserve what makes our community special and vibrant. And speaking of another one, so the amazing Polly King. So Chilton Avenue, Niagara Falls is home to just a magical vortex. This one home on Chilton Avenue has over 10,000 original pieces of art that were created by Polly King, pretty much a lifetime resident of Niagara Falls, who traveled the world, is the only artist that captured the construction of the Niagara Power Plant, literally made her way into the power plant under construction with a hard hat and said, I need to paint this, which is the only artist that did that, and the only representation of art of the construction of the Niagara Power Plant. Well, Polly passed away in 1993. Her son, Don King, who's a tireless servant and advocate of Niagara Falls, just turned 90 on November 1st. We're working with him to make sure that collection has a home, that it becomes accessible, that the over 200 portraits she painted of women in Niagara Falls who had remarkable histories will be available, because again, that's invisible history. That you can't see this right now. Very few people know about Polly King. And that's not surprising, right? In her contemporary times, when she went to school with Charles Birchfield, right? Women were still considered, first and foremost, a housewife, right? Who were raising children. And all of her journals that she wrote, and all the newspaper articles from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s referred to her first and foremost as a wife, and not as an artist, right? In addition to that, she was Jewish. And if you go to Niagara Falls today, there is very little visibility of the Jewish heritage, culture, and contribution to Niagara Falls when Main Street was built predominantly by Jewish businesses. Every single temple is now closed, right? And so how do we tell that history? And again, I'm going to go back to Polly. Polly studied with Charles Birchfield. They went to school together for art, right? He has a gallery. Polly does not. And so our role is really to make this visible and create this sense of pride about who Polly was, but also her incredible collection of what Niagara Falls was through her lens, her eyes. She captured everything from Niagara Falls State Park to Old Fort Niagara, everything. In addition to the portraits. And was the only artist in Niagara County that volunteered to create portraits of servicemen and women who were getting ready to go to duty in World War II. And so she has this incredible collection of portraits that are of those. So we want to tell her story, and this is something that we're going to continue to work towards. And it's part of our larger initiative, which is our Heritage Arts Initiative. You know, one of the best ways to make people feel better about the community is the visibility of art, right? Art inspires, art creates, and so we are doing our 4th year of public murals. We have 12 on our slate this year. We really have stepped in to remind people of what this place is. This is actually right around the corner from the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center. We have close to 14. We're starting on the north end of Main Street, which we call our home, because it has so many blank canvases, but also because it's been deeply forgotten. And so, you know, this is just another part of our incredible work. And then I'm going to wrap up with just this video. It tells a little bit more about who we are. We authored this in 2020, but it captures more the sense of our history.
We stand with the peaceful protesters of this country and the struggle for equality and justice that they represent. Over thousands of years here in the Niagara Falls National Heritage Area, the thunderous power of Niagara Falls has carved a gorge out of solid stone. More importantly, our shores have borne witness to the even greater power of the human spirit to rise and persevere. The Niagara Falls National Heritage Area preserves and shares the inspiring stories of this place. Stories transmit cultural and historical heritage. They are crucially important in crafting a society's culture because they teach behaviors, social codes, assumptions, expectations, and emotions. Oppression is perpetrated when the stories we tell omit the voices and perspectives of people of color. Therefore, our role has been to disrupt the dominant, exclusively white historical narrative that so often accompanies our cultural teachings. We fight to ensure that a diverse array of authentic voices is represented and heard. To that end, earlier this year, we advocated for Black-owned businesses in the Highland neighborhood to be included in access to over $10 million in state grant funding as part of New York State's Downtown Revitalization Initiative after the Highland community was excluded from the DRI zone in a map reminiscent of 1950s redlining. In 2019, we spearheaded a project to celebrate the history of the Highland neighborhood with 8 murals created in a collaborative community process rooted in Black history. We also convened decolonization workshops with the Haudenosaunee community, led by the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. We actively work as vocal allies to the Tuscarora and Seneca nations on whose ancestral homelands we reside. In 2017 and 18, we executed a plan that resulted in the opening of the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center, a nationally award-winning museum with a mission to transform the legacy of slavery into social change. As an organization, the National Heritage Area has donated more than 3,000 hours of staff time in direct operational support at the Heritage Center. In addition, for the past 3 years, we have been the Heritage Center's single largest cash donor. We continue to advocate, so far unsuccessfully, for operational funding to hire a permanent diverse leadership team for the Heritage Center. In this effort, we are hampered by the documented reality that museums focusing on African American history and civil rights are disadvantaged in funding. Unconscious bias and systemic racism run deep. In 2016, we addressed a lack of public acknowledgement of Underground Railroad history in Niagara Falls by reinstalling an Underground Railroad exhibit at the Niagara Arts and Cultural Center. These projects honor a proud history that spans centuries. In the 18th century, Red Jacket and Corn Planter fought for Haudenosaunee rights. The 19th century saw Harriet Tubman lead freedom seekers to Canada over the Suspension Bridge, and John Morrison, head waiter at the famed Cataract House Hotel, risked retribution as he rowed freedom seekers across the Niagara River. The 20th century brought activists such as Doris Jones and Reverend Edgar Huff, both of whom worked tirelessly for decent housing and Black businesses in the Highland neighborhood of Niagara Falls. Dr. Kay Martin helps develop SEEK, the precursor to the Equal Opportunity Program at Buffalo State College, after earning her doctoral degree while raising 5 children as a single parent. Lois Gibbs and Karen Schroeder took a stand at Love Canal igniting the environmental movement. The history of Niagara is a proud history of its courageous people. In just the past few weeks, peaceful demonstrations have occurred on the streets of Niagara Falls, continuing the long legacy of resistance and resilience that characterizes our community. Recent events have shaken us as a society. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Sandra Bland, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Tanisha Anderson, Philando Castile, Trayvon Martin, Yvette Smith, Eric Garner, and so many others. Systemic racism and violence against people of color has a long history. It must end. We understand that statements of solidarity are insufficient in the face of blatant violence against our Black and brown neighbors, colleagues, and friends. To effect change, we must not only raise our voices in a thunderous roar, we must take action, like those who came before us. With this statement, we are publicly voicing what has previously been our quiet commitment to roll up our sleeves, link arms, and get to work. We ask you to hold us accountable. Call us out on our mistakes. Call us in to be part of the solution. Together, in voice and in deed, we hold the power of Niagara to carve a path forward. In solidarity, the Board of Directors and staff of the Niagara Falls National Heritage Area.
So while that video is a couple years old, it's unfortunate that we would add to that list, right? Which gives me goosebumps as well. But I think that you get a good sense of the tremendous history in Niagara Falls and also the advocacy and the activism, because almost everything requires activism. And it doesn't mean that one history is less. It means that we should be obligated and asked to tell a full history. And that's really important because that's the only way forward for communities. And the part that I feel most strongly about is we will always be part of the solution. You can call us in, and you can also call us out if we make a mistake. Having difficult conversations around our history is hard. It's not something that's comfortable.
You see more of a trend where people are leaving.
But to be a part of it is a huge opportunity, and I think that, let's see, all right, one more slide. I'll wait for, I think that we stand, Theodore Roosevelt, there he is. Understood the fight, right? And to fight, he would ask you, I think, what challenged you more so is that it's worth fighting for, right? It's worth fighting to preserve our history. It's worth fighting to conserve our landscapes. It's worth inviting people in to understand and better understand who we are as people and how history has shaped it. But history shaping landscapes is not just my history, right? It's the other people that we share that landscape with and how they've been impacted by that history. And that's a dialogue. And I think that that expresses really what National Heritage Areas do, but what we strive specifically to do in Niagara Falls.